England, May 19, 1536. The Tower of London loomed against a pale dawn, its stones slick with the chill of early morning fog. Within the inner walls, all was deathly still, save for the soft rustling of linen, as a woman knelt in prayer. She wore a grey damask gown, modest and plain, and over her shoulders hung a crimson robe, the colour of martyrdom. Her name was Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, but soon, she would be known only as a ghost in the annals of betrayal. Above her, the raven flag stirred in the breeze. And below, a freshly sanded scaffold awaited. It had been built not out of duty, but of drama, for this was not merely a killing. It was a performance. Anne's hands trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. She had not slept. She had not eaten. Her ladies wept softly behind her, but Anne had already passed the threshold. She whispered not to God, but to her fate. The silence was disturbed only by the methodical steps of the executioner, a French swordsman, specially brought from Calais. No axe, no botched swing, no gory spectacle as had shamed others. This was to be clean, elegant, merciful. So claimed Henry VIII. But beneath the polished steel lay something far darker than death, a collapse of justice, love, and monarchy. Just 3 years earlier, Anne had stood at the pinnacle of English power, crowned with a golden coronet, carried on the backs of nobles, beloved, and feared, as the woman who changed history. She had unseated a queen, shattered a kingdom's faith, and enthroned herself as the mother of England's new royal bloodline. But now, she was branded a whore. A traitor. A witch. How did such power unravel so swiftly? What monstrous logic led England to prepare a sword for its queen? The answer lies in the nature of Tudor rule, a world where divine kingship was absolute, and wives were expendable. Henry VIII had married and in defiance of Rome itself. He broke from the Pope, scorched the monasteries, and birthed a national church, all for her. But in a world where queens were wombs for dynasties, Anne's failure to produce a male heir was her death sentence. Still, the speed of her downfall shocked even her enemies. In the course of just 17 days, Anne was arrested, accused, tried, condemned, and executed. Her supposed crimes were adultery, incest, and treason, charges riddled with inconsistencies, fabricated testimonies, and coerced confessions. 5 men, including her own brother, were swept into the same storm, executed alongside her. But the true offense was political survival. Henry wanted a son, and could no longer provide. The machinery of state had to be fed, and her blood would grease its wheels. The court fell silent as she was led to the scaffold. The Tower's ravens circled above, and spoke not with defiance, but with dignity. "I die a faithful woman to my lord and king." She knelt. A hush fell. The executioner raised his sword in a fluid arc, not directly above her, but behind his back. A distraction. A kindness, they said. She would not see it coming. Then, the blade fell. And history changed. This was not merely a death. It was a message, carved in steel, soaked in royal blood, and sent across all of Europe: betray the king, and even a queen may lose her head. Anne's body was hastily buried in an unmarked grave beneath the chapel floor. No tomb. No requiem. Just silence. But in that silence, a question lingered, not just among her ladies or her enemies or her surviving daughter Elizabeth, but in the centuries that followed. The execution of Anne Boleyn was not just a personal tragedy. It was a mirror held up to the cruel heart of Tudor England, a world where religion, monarchy, and law merged into a single, crushing machine. Her death was not random, nor was it merely the whim of a jealous king. It was systemic. Calculated. Ritualized. To understand how such horror became possible, even celebrated, we must examine the very fabric of the Tudor regime. In 1536, England was not a democracy. It was a monarchy bordering on theocratic absolutism. The king's word was law. His desires shaped divine will. The break with Rome had turned Henry VIII into not just the secular ruler of England, but its spiritual head. He was now both Caesar and Pope, answerable to no power on earth. This transformation did not occur in a vacuum. The Reformation had torn through Europe, severing ancient ties to the Catholic Church. In Germany, Luther defied the Vatican. In Switzerland, Zwingli and Calvin reimagined Christian doctrine. But in England, the schism was deeply personal. Henry's desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and marry Anne Boleyn, was denied by the Pope. In response, he cleaved his entire kingdom from the authority of Rome. The consequences were seismic. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. All subjects were required to acknowledge this, on pain of death. Refusal was heresy. Disobedience was treason. The fusion of faith and monarchy was complete. This is the system into which Anne Boleyn stepped. And it is the system that turned against her. The king's marriage to Anne was built on revolutionary zeal, but revolutions do not tolerate failure. Anne's inability to produce a male heir turned her from sacred vessel to spent shell. And in a world ruled by patriarchal succession, her usefulness had expired. The machinery of her downfall was cloaked in legality. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and architect of England's new church, orchestrated the investigation. He gathered evidence, whispers, rumors, servant gossip. He staged interrogations. He manipulated witnesses. The goal was not justice, it was conviction. What's most chilling is that all of this was done with legal precision. The Tudor state did not rely on mobs or chaos. It relied on law, sharp, efficient, and merciless. The Treasons Act of 1534 had expanded the definition of treason so far that even imagining the king's death could earn you the scaffold. Denying the legitimacy of his marriage? Treason. Criticizing his supremacy? Treason. Being too close to the queen? Treason. And was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn. The idea of a queen committing incest, plotting the king's death, and mocking his sexual performance in court was not just titillating, it was blasphemous. And that was the point. The charges were designed not only to destroy her, but to obliterate her dignity. If the people feared her rise, they would now revel in her fall. The trials were public. The executions theatrical. Crowds gathered to watch noblemen die, as if bloodshed could cleanse the realm. It wasn't just allowed. It was expected. This wasn't justice. It was a sacrament of power. Behind it all, a deeper ideology pulsed: divine right. The belief that kings ruled by the will of God. If Henry wanted and gone, then it must be God's will. And if the sword fell cleanly, without a scream, surely that was mercy, not cruelty. But why did the people accept it? Why did the nobles not revolt? Why did even Anne's former allies fall silent? Because fear works best when dressed in ritual. Public executions, royal proclamations, dramatic trials, these were not just tools of control. They were performances. They told a story, that the king was supreme, that God favored him, and that disobedience would bring ruin. Anne's death was a cautionary tale, delivered in real time, under real blood. Even her executioner, the French swordsman Jean Rambaud, was part of this ceremony. His skill, his quiet demeanor, the foreignness of his blade, all emphasized the dignity of the act. It wasn't a massacre. It was a royal rite. But dignity cannot disguise death. And law cannot cleanse injustice. Beneath the robes, the rituals, and the divine rhetoric, England had murdered its queen, not for her crimes, but for her inconvenience. And yet, in 1536, the people applauded. Because the system demanded it. Because suffering was not an accident of power, it was its currency. But symbols don't live forever. One day, blood will drip from the throne. The morning of May 19, 1536, dawned unusually bright. A clear spring sky, as if mocking the horror that was about to unfold. Inside the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, the woman for whom a king had upended an entire religious world order, prepared to die. She had not slept. Witnesses say she prayed most of the night, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping. But by dawn, she was composed. Dressed in a simple grey gown trimmed with fur, and a crimson kirtle beneath, a royal color, but no longer a queen's. Over her shoulders, she wore an ermine cloak. Her long black hair was bound beneath a linen coif. No crown. No jewels. Only dignity. And had always been theatrical, intelligent, sharp-tongued, seductive when needed, but that morning, she performed a different role, that of a martyr. Let us not soften the cruelty with romanticism. She was 35. A mother. She was innocent. And she was about to be beheaded. The scaffold had been erected inside the tower's walls, on a green lawn known to history as Tower Green, reserved for high-born executions. An audience of selected nobles and officials had gathered, silent, watching the gallows of monarchy. But there was no axe. Henry VIII, in one final flourish of control, had imported a French executioner trained with a sword. The blade, he believed, would be cleaner, swifter, more merciful. In truth, it also removed the risk of a botched English axe, and perhaps made it easier for the king to stomach the act from afar. And mounted the steps calmly. She gave a final speech, not of innocence, but of loyalty. She did not condemn the king. She praised his justice. It was the ritual demanded of the condemned, submission, not resistance. But what she said next haunted even those hardened to death. I am come hither to die. I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. It was a lie. And everyone knew it. But this lie was necessary. If she blamed him, her death might stir revolt. By showing obedience, she silenced any hint of rebellion. Then she knelt. A blindfold was tied across her eyes. And she waited. The French executioner, Jean Rambaud, stepped forward silently. He had hidden his sword in the straw, so she would not flinch. As she whispered prayers, he called to his assistant for the blade, a distraction. In that breathless moment of confusion, as she turned slightly, he struck. One clean stroke. No scream. Her head fell forward, rolling into the hay. The body collapsed in an instant, twitching briefly as blood poured onto the wood. Witnesses say her lips moved for several seconds after death. Some claimed she spoke. Most knew it was just the nerves. The Queen of England was dead. And with her, something sacred had been broken. The corpse was not buried with state honors. No grand procession. No royal tomb. Instead, her head and body were hastily placed in an old arrow chest and buried near the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the tower. No one mourned her publicly. The court had already moved on. The very next day, Henry announced his betrothal to Jane Seymour. 11 days later, he married her. Anne Boleyn's memory was wiped from official records. Her initials on royal crests were scraped off. Her portraits vanished. It was as though she had never existed. Erased from the page of Tudor history, except for the bloodstain it could never wash away. But not everyone forgot. To her supporters, her death was a warning. To her enemies, a triumph. To history, a tragedy, not just of a queen, but of a kingdom that devoured its own soul. What made Anne's execution different from the countless others carried out in Henry's reign was its intimacy. He had loved her. Had remade the world for her. And then he killed her. It revealed the terrifying truth behind absolute power, that it is not bound by love, nor loyalty, nor law. Anne Boleyn had played the most dangerous game, and lost. But in doing so, she exposed the fragility of power, the insanity of divine kingship, and the hollowness of royal mercy. She did not die alone. The men accused with her, Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and her own brother George Boleyn, had already been executed 2 days prior. Their blood paved the path to the scaffold where she knelt. But her death eclipsed them all. She was the first Queen of England to be executed. And the shadow of her fall would stretch across generations. For Elizabeth, her daughter, would rise decades later, not just to reclaim the throne, but to become the monarch who finally shattered the patriarchy that had doomed her mother. Anne Boleyn's corpse did not merely decay. It became a curse upon the very regime that created it. Anne Boleyn's execution did not disappear into the vaults of time. Though her name was silenced in royal courts and erased from state records, her death left something behind that could not be buried, a legacy of fear, and a blueprint for political elimination. In Tudor England, the axe was not just a weapon, it was a signature of royal authority. With Anne's beheading, Henry VIII made it clear, no one, not even the Queen, was beyond the reach of his wrath. Her death was a message, writ in blood, that the crown could sever any bond it deemed dangerous, even the sacred one between husband and wife, king and queen, ruler and subject. The ghosts of that message continued to haunt the English monarchy for generations. No wife of a reigning monarch would ever again be as politically visible, or as fatally vulnerable, as Anne Boleyn. Her tragedy reshaped the crown itself, birthing a new regime where queens were ornamental, silent, and obedient. But the lesson did not remain inside the walls of Tudor England. Across time, Anne's death became a symbol of state paranoia, of betrayal masked as justice, of the price women pay for power. In France, during the Revolution, another queen, Marie Antoinette, would meet the blade with a similar mix of dignity and doom. Like Anne, she had once dazzled a court with charm and wit. Like Anne, she was accused of perverse crimes, tried in haste, and executed with ceremony. And like Anne, her fall represented more than personal disgrace, it marked the unraveling of an entire regime. The state-sanctioned killing of women who once ruled beside kings became a grotesque tradition. Their deaths were never only about them. They were about silencing a lineage, erasing a threat, and controlling a narrative. In many cases, these executions were rituals of national cleansing, cloaked in legality, but soaked in vengeance. And Boleyn's ghost did not rest quietly. She became a spectral figure in literature, opera, and art. Shakespeare ignored her. But later dramatists gave her voice, often painting her as either a seductress or a saint, sometimes both. Victorian historians, obsessed with morality and family, debated her virtue. Was she the Protestant martyr or the ambitious temptress? Yet perhaps neither image captures the truth. Anne was not merely a victim or a villain, she was a consequence. A consequence of a system that demanded obedience, produced obsession, and punished the very ambition it claimed to reward. And that system, the ideological machinery that made her death acceptable, did not die with her. We see it echoed in the purges of Stalin's USSR, where loyal followers were branded as traitors overnight and eliminated with chilling bureaucracy. We see it in fascist regimes where political dissenters vanish behind closed prison doors, in the name of national purity. We see it in the erasure of memory itself, in propaganda, censorship, and historical revisionism. Anne's death taught tyrants a lesson, that if you control the spectacle of death, you control the memory of life. But it also left behind a more subversive legacy, one that those in power cannot erase. Anne's daughter, Elizabeth I, would become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. She ruled for 44 years, longer than any Tudor king, and never married. Her virginity became a political tool, but it was also a shield. Perhaps she had learned, from her mother's fate, the true danger of submitting to a king. Elizabeth reigned not as a consort, but as sovereign. And in her image, we find the lingering defiance of Anne Boleyn, a woman destroyed for stepping beyond the bounds of her gender, whose legacy would one day reign from the very throne that had ordered her death. In modern history, Anne's story has been reclaimed, not just as a Tudor tragedy, but as an early warning of how institutions eat their own, and how women are often the first to be sacrificed at the altar of power. She has become a symbol in feminist history, in discussions of state violence, in conversations about historical injustice. Her execution is no longer a mere footnote. It is a cautionary tale. Because power, when unchecked, when divine, when convinced of its own infallibility, will always create ghosts. And Anne Boleyn is one of the loudest. You can hear her still, in the Tower of London, where some say her spirit walks near the place of her death. A headless queen, carrying the memory of betrayal, echoing through stone corridors that have witnessed too many deaths. But her true haunting is not in haunted towers. It is in our laws. Our prisons. Our courts. Our politics. Whenever a state decides who deserves to live, and who deserves to die, without truth, without justice, without humility, Anne Boleyn's shadow returns. And if we do not remain vigilant, old blood will stain new robes once more. The scaffold is long gone. The hay-strewn platform, the silent crowd, the glint of the French executioner's sword, all have dissolved into dust. But the ghost of Anne Boleyn is not buried. She lingers, not as a figure of sympathy alone, but as a mirror held up to power itself. History does not repeat. But it waits. Anne's death was not simply the fall of a woman, it was the moment a nation crossed a line. A king had declared himself judge, jury, and God, wielding marriage and execution interchangeably. When the sacred bond between monarch and queen was torn apart in blood, it marked more than the end of a courtly love or a political alliance, it signaled the death of restraint itself. And that death would haunt the Tudor court. After Anne, no one was truly safe. Not Thomas Cromwell, who had engineered her fall, only to meet his own death a few years later. Not Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, beheaded for adultery. Not even Henry himself, who died grotesquely bloated and paranoid, his body rotting even before death, haunted by the ghosts he had made. But Anne's story has outlived them all. She was the beginning of something, a fracture in the illusion of monarchy. Her execution stripped the crown of its sacred glow. It revealed a human truth, that the men who rule are still men. Jealous, frightened, fallible. And that when power answers only to itself, it destroys everything it touches. That is the lesson her death carved into history. But lessons mean nothing to those who forget. Look around the modern world. At the show trials staged for political dissidents. At the imprisoned journalists, the disappeared citizens, the authoritarian leaders who rewrite constitutions to remain untouchable. These are not relics of a dark age. They are happening now, under new names, but the same veil of justice. Anne Boleyn's death reminds us, once a system decides that some lives are disposable for the sake of order, it is no longer a justice system, it is a machinery of silence. And that machinery is self-replicating. It hides behind different flags, ideologies, even technologies. It uses drones instead of swords, prisons instead of scaffolds, media blackouts instead of gallows. But the result is the same: bodies fall, truth is buried, and history is rewritten by the victors, unless someone resists. That resistance begins with remembering. Not as nostalgia. Not as romantic tragedy. But as warning. Anne Boleyn should not be remembered only for her pearls, or her sharp wit, or even for giving birth to a queen. She must be remembered for the cold morning on which her head fell, because a king's love turned to terror. She must be remembered as the moment when England looked into the eyes of absolute power, and blinked. Her death is a tolling bell. Not for pity, but for vigilance. And if we fail to hear it, we risk repeating it. In this silence, her voice still echoes. Not in the courtly poems or plays of Tudor minstrels, but in the quiet fear behind every unjust verdict, in the hesitation of every whistleblower, in the scream that is never heard because the world has turned away. History waits in ambush. The executioner no longer wears a hood, he wears a suit, a badge, a title. But the sword is still there. The stage has changed, but the performance continues. And so we must keep telling these stories. Not to glorify pain, but to unmask the systems that created it. Not to pity the dead, but to protect the living. Let the final image remain. Not a weeping court. Not a kneeling queen. But the silence afterward. The hush over the Tower Green. The stunned breath held by the world. The terrible truth that once a regime crosses the line into blood, there is no going back. Let us not forget that truth. Because when we do, old ghosts rise. New scaffolds are built. And the curse of those who forget begins again.